Hi, welcome to Kingdom Seeker's Circle. Today, we're starting the second video of Matthew, and I think it's worth being in the genealogy for a little bit, and that's why I've split it up into 3 sections. It's worth mentioning that this is a loaded passage that has a lot of information, and we often just skim through it. So, the first section of the genealogy, which we talked about in the other video, was from Abraham to David the king. This second section moves in the opposite direction, because Matthew signals this immediately by shifting the name, how he names David. David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Notice that for a moment. The king remains, but the glory begins to fade. Matthew 1, verse 6b through 11, is the story of decline. And notice how it's still part of verse 6. How quick shame can form and turn the tides is incredible. But it's not because God failed, because Israel's kings did. And Matthew carefully shapes the list of this to show us why exile happened and why a different kind of king is needed. Let's read the text, because it is worth reading these names. David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, and Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah, and his brothers, at the time of the deportation to Babylon. So Matthew ends this section with an event, and not a person this time. And that's intentional. He's breaking up that section. Notice first of all, by the wife of Uriah in the first verse of this section. This starts to begin with a simple crack in the kingship. Matthew could have written Solomon the son of David, but he doesn't. Instead, Solomon by the wife of Uriah. Bathsheba is not named here either. Matthew forces us to remember that Israel's golden king was also a king who's abused power and committed injustice and brought suffering into his own house. This detail sets the tone for this entire section. The Davidic throne continues, but it does so under the shadow of sin. The genealogy is still legitimate, but it is no longer triumphant. A line of kings is this part, and names without praise. From Solomon onward, Matthew lists king after king. What's striking is that Matthew does not say anything about them. There's no evaluations, no he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, no commentary whatsoever. Just names. Rehoboam, Abijah, Asaph, Jehoshaphat, Joram. The silence itself kind of speaks for itself. Matthew compresses centuries of history into just a list, allowing the weight of repetition to show something crucial. The original audience would know all of these stories really well. This is not a story of steady faithfulness. It's a story of institutional failure. The throne remains, but the heart of the kingdom erodes. This is where the theological choice comes. If you compare this list to the Old Testament, you'll notice something important. Matthew omits certain kings. He shortens the list, not because he's careless, but because he's shaping a particular meaning. Matthew wants 14 generations in this section, but more importantly, he wants us to see a trajectory. The line is unbroken legally, but spiritually it's fractured. It's not propaganda, it's his diagnosis. Hezekiah and Manasseh are mentioned as turning points. So 2 names stand out sharply, Hezekiah and Manasseh. Hezekiah represents reform, prayer, and temporary renewal, but Manasseh follows, and his reign is remembered for corruption and idolatry. Matthew places them back to back with no commentary whatsoever, letting the contrast speak. One faithful king cannot reverse generations of decline. This system itself is broken. And so Josiah brings another moment of hope, but it doesn't last. The genealogy ends not with reform, but with judgment. Josiah is mentioned right before the collapse, and at the time of the deportation to Babylon comes right after him, and this is the theological climax of this section. The exile is not just a historical event, it's the collapse of kingship, the loss of land and temple and throne. Matthew wants us to feel the weight. The promise to David still stands, but the kings have led the people into ruin. The throne still exists on paper, but not in power. So why does this end with exile? Matthew could have rushed past this. Instead, he anchors the genealogy to exile. Why? Because exile answers the question, why do we need the Messiah? Not just for forgiveness, not just for teaching, but for restoration of a failed kingdom. The exile exposes that human kings, even anointed ones, cannot save God's people. Something greater is needed. So we're concluding this passage with that it's the second list of names that Matthew mentions. God keeps his promises even when their leaders fail. The Davidic line survives judgment, but is stripped of glory, and the exile creates longing for a king who will not repeat the past. Matthew is preparing us for a question. If the throne is led to exile, what kind of king must Jesus be? The answer is coming.